Thank you and welcome back. Just to do the introductions, my name is Bryan McSweeney. I'm with Transport and Main Roads. And as mentioned there in the bio, I guess probably considered to be a bit of a dinosaur, working for the same organisation for over 46 years. But I've had a number of different roles through Transport and Main Roads and actually have really, I guess, enjoyed the journey that I've had. It was great to see Neil here this morning to open the session. And I'll hand you over to Colin to start the presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Yep, that's on, yes. Yes, so I'm Colin Mann. I work for PCSG, and I've been working with Brian through the course of this year. But let's move on in the interest of time. Is that the clicker? It is. So I made a mistake first thing this morning. I told Neil Scales that I was a Newcastle United supporter, and I didn't expect him to take it as personally as he did. He also then stole a lot of my thunder. But that's okay. I mean, I was going to talk a little bit about why TMR need to do BIM, and I think it's fine to sort of repeat that message a little bit. I think that it's fantastic, obviously, that Neil is supportive of BIM at TMR. I think that makes it possible. I don't think it makes it easy necessarily. And a huge part of the work that that Bryan needs to do and others at TMR is to build buy-in and traction to BIM. A lot of that does come from sort of the dollar figure message, the saving of cost and the development of business case. And that's a hugely frustrating topic for me in some ways because I've been working in it for a long time, and it might be frustrating to others in the room as well. You know, I think a lot of people now really understand and intuitively know that BIM is hugely beneficial and kind of just want to get on with it. And the idea of creating business cases around it is a little bit frustrating. But executives have a lot of decisions to make in terms of where they invest. Even if you have that rock-solid return on investment for BIM, it's still an investment. It still has to be chosen over other things. And that's a lot of the work that TMR will be doing in the coming months and maybe years around why we're doing it, why we benefit from it, and specifically how TMR benefit from it. So what changes, and what do we stop doing as well, which is often the hardest part. And again, as Neil himself mentioned, a lot of this is not just much about money, or as much about money. It's about the reputation of TMR as an organisation needing to be leading the agenda to get what they want, not necessarily dragged along. And I've got retention on there, but retention as much as recruitment. So how do we get that the next generation of engineer into TMR? So a lot of different reasons there, but the good news is that the journey's up and running for TMR, and I'm going to let Bryan go through where we are.
Thank you, Colin. And as Neil started out this morning sort of saying he put up that piece on the state infrastructure plan, so that's really what started it for us, Transport and Main Roads. We had been looking at BIM, obviously, prior to that, but really the drive by the state government to do an implementation strategy that says BIM into road transport infrastructure and vertical infrastructure by 2023. And I think from Transport and Main Roads perspective, taking a look at the dollar value at the moment, we are looking at BIM generally on projects $100 million plus. So we haven't quite taken it right into business as usual. We are running a number of pilots. I think Rock-Led Arrows got a bit of press recently at a number of different functions. Neil also spoke about M1, M3. There's a fair bit going on down in the south coast about Mudgeeraba Varsity Lakes. We are in central Queensland with Horton River floodplain and further north in Cairns for the Smithfield bypass. So there's a number of projects that are going on, and I think what we've managed to achieve over the period of time from the 2016 start to where we are today is picking up some learnings from those projects, particularly in the contract environment, to make sure that we get the right words into the contracts when we're going out, and we are doing both design and construct and what we term TICCO, or Principal Supplied Design. So we are running BIM on both of those types of projects. What we chose to do early in 2018, and why Colin is here to support me today in this presentation, is we then took a bit of a pause and a bit of a time out to say, okay, let's take a look at what are the processes and practices end to end for BIM implementation in an organisation like Transport and Main Roads. So you do actually need to start right back there at the start and understand what we're trying to achieve for BIM implementation and the business improvements that we can make or identify throughout that process. And I think that's also where we can start to look at how do we bring lean into this process of BIM. So we've got Colin and the team from PCSG in, and they've taken a look at the legacy processes and practice that we have in place, and looking at what are we starting, as Colin said, what are we stopping, what's new, what's old, how do we actually bring some of the people along, and I think that's another key perspective that we'll talk about. So there are a number of different pieces of work that we've been doing. I think we're reasonably well along the journey, particularly in, say, the design space, but I think we need to pick up a few more learnings in the construction area. So that's the next piece of the business we need to be looking at. So what do we do? I think most people would recognise the strategy that we've adopted in TMR is certainly around the 4 work streams of technology, information management, processes and documentation, and then the people piece, the capability and the cultural change at the back end. I think, as I said, the technology's there in the software applications that we've got, and I think I heard a question earlier today to Neil about what are we doing with software. We are trying to be as software agnostic as we possibly can on the contractor side. But from a Transport and Main Roads perspective as a client, there are some deliverables that we need to be delivered back to us. So hopefully that answers that question, or I can discuss that a little bit further. And obviously on technology then, the step change for us is having been modelling in 3 dimension for quite a considerable period of time, but generally around what we term string-based modelling or alignment-based, so that we set direction for machinery guidance system to follow the strings of the design in the design model. The step change for us now is into an object-based model, and really the things that we need to be focusing on is what we want to use that object-based model for, and from my perspective it's all around asset management. You probably take a listen to what Neil was talking about. I guess Transport and Main Roads is not necessarily recognised as a facilities manager, but as Neil said, we've got over 13,000 k of roadway, over 3,100 something bridges, so there's a lot of asset management as part of TMR's DNA, and that's really where we need to be with BIM, in making sure we're getting the right information flowing through to those areas. The documentations and standards, so we are looking at, we've adopted NatSpec National BIM Guide as a bit of a process guide, and I think most would recognise that the text within that document's probably a lot more to do with vertical infrastructure than linear, but I'm a process man, so I'm happy to see how the process flows. And then obviously PAS 1192 out of UK, ISO 19650 when it comes. So there's some of the things that we're looking at from process and documentation. Common data environment, we are looking to do obviously the workflows and how that all comes together, BIM being collaborative as best we can, running through those workflows. And then into the people and capability piece. So what are we doing there, and actually getting our people engaged both internally in TMR and externally in the market area. So the complexities of that sort of process in an organisation like Transport and Main Roads. We are very much siloed, or in some way functional organisations. So we've got one area of asset management that sits in the corporate area. We've got other areas of asset management that sit in the bridge space, and then we've got a road operations and an information system that sits in another piece. So I've actually been charged with putting together a steering committee, a governance steering committee that tries to bring those different disparate pieces of the organisation together to understand what are the business benefits that can be derived from BIM implementation, and what do we need to do in each of those spaces. I think at the moment I've got over 10 working groups that we're trying to pull together in that space to discuss business benefits, workflows, process flows, and how we actually achieve the outcome that we're looking to achieve from BIM. The other side of that coin is that we're not doing it in isolation. We are part of the Queensland BIM Working Group, which is led by the Department of State Development, Manufacturing, Infrastructure and Planning. So we are actually sitting at the table, albeit the only linear infrastructure group at the table with the Queensland BIM Working Group. But so health and education and corrective services. We even have Treasury sitting at the table, and the State Archives. So we've got a very good working group across the Queensland government agencies about what we're trying to do at a government level for BIM implementation. But what we also need to consider then is how do we actually take that? I mean, if you take a look at the policy that's been, or the draft policy that's been out there by DSD MIP, talks about BIM being open, managed, supportive, and I've forgotten the fourth, but it is sitting there in the background. So we're actually looking at a group of policies and principles that underpin how we do BIM implementation. And then obviously as a state government agency, we are generally, our remit is the state controlled road network, but obviously in doing that work we do bump heads occasionally with the local government areas in the work that we're doing, so actually taking a look at how do we communicate with the local government areas about the work that we're doing from a BIM implementation perspective. And then obviously the people in the room here today, the supply chain. How are we actually getting the work done? How are we putting it into the contracts? Are we doing that in a way that works? I think the term, and I know that we've got some contracts guys here, I think the collaborative project agreement is the contract type we're using currently within Transport and Main Roads. And certainly from a BIM perspective, it is all around the collaboration, because I think we all recognise that we're all on the same journey here. I think it's about understanding the benefits that we can get from a client perspective, and also what can we do for our industry partners. And I'll hand back to Colin now to roll through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Brian. So the message from that last slide was it's very, very difficult. It's a very complex thing to do at TMR. And we certainly don't have time to talk about the extent of the roadmap and the change program that TMR will have. But sort of needless to say, it's a combination of quite a lengthy and strategic change program, and some of the shorter and the quicker near wins that we can have, and even Neil mentioned some of those as well, some of those pilot projects. To give you a couple of examples that TMR are going to be working on in the fairly near future. One of them is a common data environment perspective, both really thinking about the client-side project information model and then the transition into an asset information model. And yes, the technology, but also the business change and the business process change that has to go along with that. Something happening right now is trying to understand just how far the tentacles of BIM reach within this organisation and exactly who is impacted. Even just trying to figure that out within TMR is quite a difficult and complex thing to do. But again, the good news is that that's underway. Another example, and it's a sort of a decision that TMR is going to have to make, is sort of how involved do they get in education and training of suppliers. I don't know what the answer is today, but is something that TMR are going to have to consider. What is the role of an organisation like TMR in terms of educating and upskilling the supply chain? We've seen different examples of that in different areas, some very, very engaged, some very hands-off. There are arguments either way, and it's an interesting point that TMR are going to be looking at quite carefully over the coming months. And then sort of away from the technology, away from the process, there is a big, huge people side of this, which is not a new message. And you've probably seen some sort of similar imagery to that boat before in relation to a BIM change program. I'm pretty sure that Bryan is there with the megaphone in the middle of the boat, and there are plenty of people rowing the boat at TMR. I think that a bit more work is required still, despite Neil's words earlier around that the vision, the guy at the front there, sort of trying to work out exactly where they are trying to get to and what they want to get out of it. But the good news is the boat's definitely moving. And from my experiences at TMR, there's people are all over that change curve. There's certainly still a bit of frustration around there on the left-hand side. Good news is there's a lot going on in that experimental side on the right there as well. So the work to do now is to really sort of encourage and promote the work that's going on in that experimental phase and really getting the best out of that, and lots of internal marketing communication. And then obviously work on for the people still on the left-hand side of this curve, just how do we get them through this and get them to understand a bit more about what it's all about. And I think, again, Neil alluded to this as well, this is a bit of a long-term game for TMR. And for the industry in general, it's really important that TMR end up with some of the bright sparks coming out of the education pipeline now. That demographic is starting to change, if not already. So we're going to see a different demographic of newly qualified engineers coming through. The challenge for TMR is to get some of them to come and work for TMR and not end up all of them end up in the supply chain. And that sort of goes back to the first message in this presentation around why they should be doing something now. These engineers are going to want to work for a progressive and digitally enabled organisation. So if TMR want to attract these people, they have to be doing stuff now. It's a long game. But with that in mind, just back to Bryan for how you can help.
Thanks again, Colin. So certainly from our perspective, it is around the positive engagement with the process. I think we recognise, as I said earlier, this is change that we're going through and we need to understand that and work with that. Part of that sort of says the collaboration that we do see through the development of BIM management plans and what we're looking for in the implementation of some of the documentation. We're really keen to hear from you as industry partners as to how we're actually going with that. Are we hitting the mark? How do you feel? I see quite often that, as I say, the capability sits more in the marketplace, unfortunately, than it does with transport and main roads. Our internal design staff and others won't be working on BIM projects until we start to drop that $100 million plus sort of figure down. So we really are reliant very much on industry partners to assist us in what we're achieving with BIM outcomes and making sure that we're all heading in the same direction. So from that perspective, I think it's just a call to arms to everybody in industry that when we come to negotiate around BIM deliverables under the contract, we make sure that we are actually being more collaborative rather than hard-nosed on the contract negotiations. That's the time for us, I think. So any questions?